Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today we're going to go over how to get the best quality out of Rust with little to no frame loss. The first thing we're going to jump into is the options. And the first setting we're going to go over will be field of view. For this option, I turn it all the way up since it doesn't impact performance at all and allows you to see more on the screen. The second thing we're going to be going over is compass visibility. I leave that on because it is really important when you're in PvP. You do callouts at, for example, East 120. They'll be able to know where people are, where things are that you're calling out. It makes things a lot more organized. So for that, I leave that on. For the nudity, I put underwear because recording purposes, you don't want to have nudity on the game. And then hide signs. People are racist and do a bunch of weird shit on this game, so keep that on. And then the other option that's pretty important is max gibs. This setting is how many broken objects you can see at one time. So if you have a weak PC, turning this up all the way, it won't impact the performance until you start actually doing things like raiding and breaking walls, etc. So I usually leave mine about 1,000 because I don't really care about seeing broken stuff, and putting it at 1,000 is a pretty good medium for not having your computer die when you go raiding. And then now we're going to head over to the graphics where most of our performance settings will be. And under graphics, you're going to see the graphics quality. This setting is one that depends on all the other settings that you have turned on. You can turn this setting on up to 6, and if everything else is turned off, it really won't impact your computer performance too much. You may lose some frames, but the quality you'll get is pretty worth it to me. So I'm going to turn that on. Computer might freeze, crash, whatever it might do, just because I have the game on in the background. But if you're doing this, definitely go to the main menu before doing that, or else you're going to be there for a second. With graphic quality at 6, you can already see a huge improvement. This is the after. Let's go to the before really quick. You can see just by turning it to 6, you get a huge improvement over what it is at 0, and it's not too big of a performance hit because we don't have anything else turned on yet. So I'm going to turn that back up to 6. And again, it just looks so much better, and you don't take that much of a graphics hit turning it up like this. The next thing we're going to go over is the shadow quality. The shadow quality impacts quite a bit of performance because shadows take up a lot of your graphics card's resources. For this, I'm going to turn it up myself because there's not huge graphic impact to my computer. However, if you do have a weaker PC, you will want to turn this down to 0. It's not a huge improvement on the way things look, and it does take quite a bit of resources out your graphics. And then the next thing we're going to go over is called shadow cascades. This setting impacts performance as well. As you can see, it says the number of distance splits for the sun and moon shadows. The lower this is, obviously the more performance you're going to get. I usually put mine around 2 because it does make things look a lot better and it doesn't impact the graphics that bad having it at 2. However, of course, if you have a very weak PC, leave that at 0. 2 cascades is okay if you have a pretty decent computer that's not like $2,000. The next thing you're going to want to go over is the max shadow lights. This setting turned up to 3 is almost impossible to see in your base because it determines how realistic the lighting will be. I usually just leave mine at 0 because it'll be dark as hell in your base, even if you have a campfire on. Say you have a 2-story base. The first story having a fire won't show to the second story. Having this at 0 fixes that. That's what I've noticed. And then right after that, we're going to go into the water quality. This setting helps make the water look better. However, I think that the water already looks as good as it can get. Let's run over there and see what I'm talking about. With this, if you turn up the water quality all the way, it looks a little bit better, but it's just going to give you stuff like, for example, if you were in real life, you'd see foaming towards the shore because the tides are rolling in and out. You'll see the foaming, and then you'll see a lot more ripples, and it makes it a lot better of a quality, but it does impact your computer a lot when you have the shader levels up. So what I'm going to do is turn mine to 1. That's what I have mine at. I have a great PC, but it's not worth it to put it at 2 for me because it does impact a lot more with shaders up than it's worth to have it at 1. And then the second thing I like to apply is the water reflections. Turning this up does impact your computer, but it's not going to impact it a whole bunch. Turning it up, you won't see it too well on here, but if you were, let's say, like over here, where there's like masses of water inside the map, it will make it look a lot better. I usually leave mine at 2. That way, it just looks better, and it doesn't impact it too much. It does impact it a little bit, but nothing crazy. So if you have a weaker PC, you can go ahead and turn that to 0, and it won't do too much a difference to have it on or off. It just makes things look a lot better, in my opinion. The next thing will be world reflections. This setting doesn't have a huge impact, so I usually turn that up as well. I'm not even too sure exactly what it does. I looked into it and I didn't find much, but what I did find out is that it does literally nothing to my performance at all. So I go ahead and leave mine up at 2. And then the next thing I'm going to go over is the actual shader level. The shader level is what gives the game life. What I mean by that is, if we go over to here, I'll show you. You can see the ground has a bit of texture to it, but for the most part it looks pretty basic and boring. And then the grass and then the trees, everything looks pretty simple. It's because we have the graphics at 6. It's not hitting the performance too hard. However, once we start turning the shader levels up, it will start hitting it a lot. To show you what exactly the shader levels do, I'm actually going to turn it back down to 0 for the sake of showing you the impact it makes. As you can see, the ground looks horrible again, but if we turn up the actual shader levels even just a little bit, it looks a lot better than it used to. What I found out about the shader level is that there's usually 4 points of impactfulness, you can say. Obviously 0 being the worst. However, it gives you the best performance. Even if you turn it on a tiny bit, it will impact your computer if it's a lot weaker. Turning it on just even 1. I mean, it goes by 5, I'm pretty sure, but it makes it look so much better. And the price you pay in performance for how this looks, it's basically nothing. You're really getting a lot for nothing. And from the 100 to 200 range, that is going to be a level of impactfulness that is lower. So as you can see, things look even better than it was, and it's not going to impact your computer much more than it would be if it was at 105. Now, if you have a really, really weak PC, of course it will, but considering you can run it at 5 and basically see no performance damage, 105, then 200 won't do much either. And then from there, going from 200 to 500 is where you're going to get a lot of the performance hit. From 200 to 300, you'll see a change in the quality of terrain around you, so it starts looking realistic now. But from 300 to 400 is where you're going to get a lot of impact. Right here is when you're going to start seeing, even if you have a weaker PC that can handle most games, that's where you start seeing the lag come in. If you're at 6, if you're at 0 and run this up to 500, you probably won't see too much. But even running it at 300, it gives the game a lot more depth. It looks really nice, and it doesn't impact your PC as much as it would if you were running it at level 6 graphics with 0 shaders. From 300 to 400, you don't see too much of an impact, but things do get a lot more in-depth. Not necessarily 3D, but then you'll start seeing things like pebbles and twigs and leaves on the floor, stuff like that. This is mostly for terrain, however, it does affect minor stuff, but the biggest one you're going to see is the detail of the rocks, the detail of the ground, the detail of everything that is really what you're looking at. Individual objects such as trees, hemp plants, palm trees, anything that's like its own entity that can be destroyed, you really won't see a huge improvement in that for shader level. But in the things that are static, like the ground, the rocks, things like that, you will see a huge improvement. Going from 400 to 500, you'll see an even more in-depth detailing. So for example, the ground does look better, but it also changes the water a bit. So if you look in the background right now, sorry, the sand, the beach area, you see the sand looks pretty, it looks a lot better. Let me go back to 0 so you can see the difference. So 0, 200 looks funny, but looks better, of course. Then you go 300, then it starts looking more detailed. Then you go 400, doesn't change too much, but then you go 500, then it starts looking darker because it's supposed to be wet technically. So we go here, you can see how it's kind of going and then just drops off because that's where the ocean starts. 500, it's a lot easier to see, it's a lot more detailed, a lot better overall. Then let's go 600. You won't see too much from 500 to 600, so you could try to leave it at 500, but from 500 to 600 there's really no performance impact either. So the levels that I like to really care about is the 0 or 100 to the 200 mark. That's the one of the bigger impacts for your graphics. And then from 200 to 400 is a pretty, so from is a medium impact, and then 400 to 600 is going to be the biggest impact, which is huge. If you leave this at 0 and turn everything else up, you'll honestly probably have a pretty decent running game, but then again, it's not going to look the greatest. So I like to put mine, if you're a weaker PC, if you're very weak, I'd recommend 200. You should be able to run 200, especially at the lower graphics qualities. But personally, if you can run it, I would just run it at 400. That's a good one to keep your game out, maybe a little bit over 5 if you have a decent game and you are willing to turn a lot of these other things down. But that's what the shader quality does, the shader level, sorry. And with the graphics turned up, I'll show you what that looks like just so you can see. It's of course a lot easier to see with the graphics quality down because everything already looks a little bit better with the graphics quality. So this is what things look like with it turned to 6. And then we're going to turn the shader level all the way up with this as well. And as you can see, things look a lot more detailed. Little grass textures. You go down here to the sand. You can see that the sand looks, it's a lot harder to see since I'm starving. Okay, I just respawned, my health was at 0, so I had to come back so you can see things clearly. This is what the game looks like with 6 and shaders turned down to 0. However, this is what it looks like at max shaders, max graphics quality. So as you can see with the both turned on, it does look really, really nice, even though everything else is turned down in both graphics and image effects. And you can see that this right here alone is really what makes the game. And then all these other things do impact performance. So if you really want to have a good game, you can sacrifice everything else for shader quality, and the higher graphics quality, say 3 to 6, is really what gets the graphics quality looking good. And then have everything else turned off if you have a PC that's struggling to play this. However, these two things are what make the game look great. From the draw distance, in this setting is how far the land renders from the 500 to the 2500 mark. Having it all the way up allows you to see the airplanes and helicopters in the distance. So let's say you're at 500 and you look to the sky to look for a helicopter you might hear. You're not actually going to be able to see it because the draw distance is so low. If you turn it all the way up to 2500, you'll see it from way far away. And what I'm going to do is turn mine up to max. But if you have a weaker PC, you might want to leave it at 2000. Since this is such important to the gameplay itself, to the gameplay itself, you don't want it under 2000. It doesn't impact your PC almost at all, considering what you're getting from it. And 2000 is just a, don't go under that. If you need to have a little bit of performance help, go to 2000. But 2500 is absolutely worth it. I wouldn't change it at all. The shadow distance, this setting is how far the shadows can render on objects. So if there's a building like 2 squares away and you can see it from where you're at, you'll be able to see it. However, the further the shadows are, the lower the quality is. So if you see my plate right here, how it's at 1000 for the shadow distance. If I look low, if I get closer, you can see that the edges are really jagged. However, if I bring it down further, the edges go away. That's because with the more shadows it renders, the lower quality they have to be, or else the game literally just cannot run. So you want your game to be able to see a shadow across the world, put it at 1000. I leave mine at 50 because it looks so much better. And then going into the anisotropic filtering, this has a huge impact on your game as well. If you turn this up to 16, it is not at all worth what you're sacrificing for. You can run this at 16 and lose 10 frames now, but you're going to be losing 30, 40 frames when you're actually moving around, breaking stuff, going crazy. So I leave this at 1. It's not worth it unless you have a $3,000 PC that can run just about anything in the world. Anisotropic filtering is not worth it for the performance loss that you will receive throughout your gaming experience. And then moving on to the parallax mapping. This setting makes the things look 3D. I usually leave mine at 0. Doesn't do much for me and takes up a lot of performance that's not worth it. And then I move on to grass displacement. This doesn't do much, to be honest, for your performance. But if you can see here, my rock's in the way. You can see that when you walk over grass, it's going to displace it, so it'll move it. It'll move it whenever you walk over it. It doesn't do much, and you can't really tell anyways in game. And it does do minimal impact on your computer. I just leave mine off. Doesn't matter to me. And then from there, we're going to get into the mesh quality. And all of these have a medium to high impact on performance because you're going to be starting to turn up individual objects. For example, your particle quality, your object quality, those will start going up. It'll start rendering more and putting more detail into certain things, which a lot of people go back and forth on if it's worth it or not. Me personally, I think that turning some of these up is worth it and some of them aren't. For example, the particle quality, all this setting does is if you have like a chimney or a fireplace or anything going on, I said chimney, I meant furnace, anything like that going on, turning this up will determine how high quality the smoke comes out. If you don't have 20,000 furnaces going on at once, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to impact your computer at all. But if you do have a furnace farm or even a large furnace farm going on, it might actually start to impact your computer performance just a little bit. So I usually leave mine off because I don't care about smoke, the way smoke looks. Other things this might impact could be rockets and C4. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm assuming anything that's smoke related or kind of like that as well. For example, if the game had snow in it or rain in it for whatever reason, particle quality will be impacted by those things. And then the next one we go to is object quality. This setting determines what will be rendered at a distance for the objects. So the lower that this is, the closer things will be rendered, and then the further things won't be rendered. But if you don't have this at least a 5, then you might not be able to see through the ladder hatches and some of the walls. For example, like twig or sheet, you can see through those, but if you have this all the way off, it won't render any of the texture and you won't be able to see through it anymore. Sheet, I know they just did an update where you can't really see through it, but for example, a ladder hatch or a twig wall, you can still see through those for the most part. And if you have this at 0, you won't be able to. I usually run mine up to 200 because it impacts it a little bit for what you're getting from it. It makes things look a lot better and just makes your game look a lot less cheap. And then from there, we have the tree quality. If you're in a really dense area, for example, an entire forest that's huge, you will experience performance loss if you are in those areas. However, if you turn this down to 0, you won't experience too much frame loss, and you won't be missing out too much on the trees. The trees do look a lot denser when you turn it up. For example, if I turn it up to the max setting, you'll see it has a lot more detail to it, more leaves, more stuff on the branches. If you're in a forest, it takes like I want to say 2 to 5 frames if you have a really nice PC. If you have a weaker PC, about the same, but that might be the difference between 30 and 40 frames. So up to you. You can mess around with that, see what's good for you or not good for you. I like to go into a server that has nobody in it. That way you can run around and kind of test out, see how things are going. And if you're doing that, make sure you're doing it on a server with good ping. That way you're testing out your actual graphic capacity and not the server capacity on 300 ping. So I like to turn mine all the way up for tree quality. For the max tree meshes, I'm not exactly sure what that even does. I don't want to go over that too much because I don't have any clue on what it actually does. I run mine at 100. I don't see any performance loss, but then again, I don't know what it does. The next one that we're going to be going over is the terrain quality. This determines how detailed the terrain or the floor, because the terrain is what we're standing on, looks. This does have a huge performance impact since there's a lot of terrain, and it renders it before you even see it. So on the other side of the hill, there's going to be rendering going on down there, and considering that as far as you can see, it having it at max, it will be rendered. It has a huge impact on your performance. So what I do is I go up by 10, and every 10, if you can run around and still not have too much frame loss, then you're good. Then go to the next until you're satisfied. I can run mine at max, not a big deal. This is really important if you have your lower graphics quality and lower shader level, because it does make your game look a lot better. And then the next one you're going to go over is the grass quality. Grass in any game impacts the graphics. However, in this game, the grass is going to be there. You can't turn it on or off. You don't want to give advantages to people. And although the setting, it does have an impact on performance because there's a lot of it. I believe that you should have this turned up all the way to 100. And the reason that I say that is because at 0, there will be a lot of grass popping in and out while you're running or riding a horse or driving, etc. It makes it hard to determine if you saw a person moving or if you saw grass popping up. And it's really just annoying in general when you're just running through or riding through and grass is starting to pop up, and it not only does make the game look worse, but it actually might mess you up in certain situations where you're really having to pay attention to what's going on around you. And then from there, the decor quality, the higher you turn that up, the more you'll see like flowers and stuff like that pop up. So this is a good example here. If I turn this up to 100, you're going to see stuff like this, little flowers popping up everywhere, a little more details, very minor things. However, I leave it off because it might be harder to see things on the floor, such as an AK with a bright red skin being right next to or under something like this. Obviously this you'd be able to see pretty well, but if you have a lower quality setting and you're in areas where you're really stressed out, it'll be a lot harder to see things and pick them up. So the less you have on your screen, the less you have interfering with your game while you're doing PvP or just running for your life, picking stuff up. It's a good advantage to have. And then that'll be it for the graphics quality, and from there we're going to go to the image effects. Most of it's for things such as immersion, if you will, things that make the game look a lot more realistic, a lot better, and generally none of these will have an impact on your game, so you can go nuts with this. The anti-aliasing will have an impact, but it's not huge. I leave mine off if you're struggling with frames, but you can run it up to max and you will have a performance hit about 5 to 10 frames. Really it's just up to you. Mess with that, see how your game handles each of them. Depth of field, you don't want to turn that on. It looks stupid, looks trash. For example, that bush there looks good, but the grass over here looks blurred out. That's because you have the depth of field on. The depth of field literally does nothing but make the game worse. And then with the ambient occlusion, this setting makes the crevices on things look a lot darker. it makes everything look a lot darker. So the grass has shade to it. For example, I turn this off, you can see how it's a lot brighter and a lot more openly one color, if you will, one dimensional type shading going on here. You turn this on, you're almost adding depth to everything. So the grass behind the grass look a lot more darker, and although it looks pretty like this to an extent, putting this on, I prefer it because it does make the game look a lot more realistic, a lot better. Things aren't the same exact color, the same exact shape, the same exact everything like it was before. I leave mine on. And with the high quality bloom, this setting makes the bright lights appear to glow realistically. And I usually keep this on since it doesn't impact in performance. I'll leave that on. It's a cool little thing. Doesn't really matter if you have it on or off. It's not going to affect any gameplay. It's really just a look. And then lens dirt, I turn that off. It really has no purpose other than to put dirt on the person, so your character's eyes. It makes things look a little dirtier to try to make it look a little more realistic. I have no clue how making things look a little dirtier is more realistic, but that's what they have on. I turn mine off, and then from there we got motion blur. Motion blur is always bad. You turn the screen, it makes it look like you're running at 20 frames. No point in putting motion blur on. I turn that off. Now with the sun shafts, the definition of a sun shaft is a beam of sunlight that appears to radiate from the sun's position. So in this case, when you look at the sun, a beam of light appears to come from the sun itself. So we're looking at the sun, you can't really see it, but if we start going off the screen, you can kind of start seeing how there would be a beam of light. Sharpen makes things look a lot sharper, a lot more detailed. Depends on how you prefer your game to look. I like it on. Makes things look a little bit sharper. It's kind of like having an app on your phone when you take a picture and it has the ability to sharpen or not sharpen it. It's the same exact thing. It's kind of like a sharpen effect on everything. And then for the I don't know how to say that, vignetting, I turn that off. If you look at the edge of the screen, so for example, let's go over here in this corner, you'll see that it's a little bit darker. I will turn it off and you can see that it's not darker. I turn mine off just because, like I said, I don't like too many things to be obstructing the view of what you're seeing. It does look a little cooler, I guess, but I just leave mine off. No use in having that on for me. It's up to you whether you prefer it or not. And then you have these experimental settings, sustain pedal support. So basically, if you have a MIDI piano, you can plug that in. That's just for MIDI devices, really. Contact shadows, these are experimental, so even if you turn them on or off, they might not work. They might actually bug your game out and mess it up. That's all the settings for the most part. At that point, your game should be running smooth.